An expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he said, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" He said to him, "What is written in the law? What do you read there?" He answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And he said to him, "You have given the right answer. Do this, and you will live." But, wanting to vindicate himself, he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Jesus replied, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell into the hands of robbers, who stripped him, beat him, and took off, leaving him half dead." A few months ago, the Vice President of the United States, who is a newly minted Roman Catholic convert, was doing an interview. He began to speak about a Roman Catholic teaching known as Ordo Amoris, or the Order of Love. He explained that the Ordo Amoris meant that you needed to prioritize who you love, and that you have to start with those closest to you. Family came first. Then you needed to take care of your closest neighbors and community, then your country, and only after that you could think about immigrants and foreigners. The assumption behind that statement was that love only comes in limited quantities. There is only so much of it to go around, and so you have to give it out carefully so that you do not run out of it. That's why you have to make sure that love goes to the people closest to you first. Now, I'm no expert on Roman Catholic moral teaching, so I'm not going to argue with him. I'll just note that he got some pushback from people who are experts, including a certain American bishop named Robert Prevost, who tweeted back at him that his explanation was just wrong. And given that Robert Prevost has since changed his name to Leo XIV, I think that maybe that guy might have known what he was talking about. But I do understand where the vice president was coming from. When it comes to loving others, we would usually prefer to limit the love we give, to just offer it to those people who are closest to us, the ones we already want to love anyway. When a man asked Jesus who his neighbor was, surely that was the kind of answer he was looking for. He wanted to get off the hook when it came to loving the people he didn't want to love. Jesus wasn't about to let him off the hook, but he was smart. Brilliant, in fact. He didn't just give a straight answer. That would have only made the man defensive. Nope, Jesus told a story instead. He knew that stories can get in underneath people's defenses and help them to see even complete strangers in sympathetic ways. But Jesus' story was more powerful than we often realize. People know this parable well, and get a number of things right about it, They recognized that Samaritans were people that Judeans, people like Jesus, despised. And so, it is generally understood that Jesus is saying that loving your neighbor has to include loving people who are not like you. So far, so good. But he was also saying more than that. For one thing, he doesn't seem to be saying to his fellow Judeans that they should love Samaritans, at least not directly. Instead, he is giving an example of a Samaritan who loves a Judean. And given the twisted relationship that Samaritans and Judeans had, that was a much more powerful thing to say. But you really need to enter into the story to appreciate that. So let's try to do that. This is Retelling the Bible. Episode 9.16, The Un-Neighbourly Judeans. Hiel of Samaria was finally on his way home from Jericho. He never liked to go there, for it was deep within Judean territory. But Jericho was an important hub for trading throughout the entire region. Hiel had done pretty well for himself in business lately. He had his own donkey for the transport of goods and more than a couple of denarii jangling in his purse. But the trade he was engaged in passed through Jericho, and that made periodic trips there unavoidable. The main road out of Jericho went directly across the plain and up into the hills towards Jerusalem. He had no intentions of going to the big city, which he despised, but it made sense to follow the well-worn trail for several leagues before turning off north towards Samaria. He was aware that because valuable trade goods often passed along this road, it was a frequent target of bandits and thieves. He'd been lucky so far on his journeys, but he always felt vulnerable when he traveled here, always aware of his surroundings, and always viewing everyone else with suspicion. He sighed and urged his donkey to a faster pace. The journey always gave him a lot of time to think. Why is it, he asked himself, that the Judeans hate us so much? It's not because we have ever done anything to them. We have never attacked them, confiscated their land, or desecrated their temple, have we? No. Come to think of it, those are all things that the Judeans have done to us, over the last century. No, the only grievance that they have is the way that we worship. Oh, we worship the same God and follow the same scriptures, or at least they're pretty much the same. No, it is just, they say, that we worship God in the wrong place and have some different traditions. That's it. And it is not as if we could do anything to change their opinion of us. We aren't welcome to worship in their temple in Jerusalem, and no reform of our worship will ever be good enough for them. So, it's really nothing we have done to make them hate us, and nothing that we could do to make them stop. Is it any wonder that I feel so helpless every time I pass through Judea? As Hiel continued down the road, there was a man approaching from the other direction. He was, as was abundantly clear from his fancy robes and high attitudes, one of the priests of the Jerusalem temple. As he drew near, Hiel braced himself. He fully expected the man to insult him, or maybe even spit at him, as such priests love to do to Samaritans. Much to his surprise, though, the priest did nothing of the sort. Rather than displaying the haughtiness for which the priesthood was famous, he appeared flustered and spooked, as if he'd just seen some horror. Soon after him came a Levite. The Levites also worked in the temple, carrying out secondary tasks. Hiel would have fully expected such a person to insult him in some way under normal circumstances. But, as he approached, his attitude was much like the priest's had been. He was so upset and hurried that he scarcely gave Hiel a glance, much less the customary sneer he usually would have received. The Samaritan did not understand what was going on, but he was happy enough to see these men having a hard time, being uncomfortable. The Judeans had done enough to destroy the worship and priesthood of the Samaritans over the years. Just over a century ago, and entirely unprovoked, the Judeans had come and attacked Galilee and Samaria. In a series of bloody battles, they had seized control of the land. They had dispossessed many Samaritans and Syrians in Galilee and filled it with Judean settlers. That alone would have been affront enough. But, even worse, Hiel said to himself, around the same time they came into the heart of our land and destroyed our most holy place. They razed the temple of the Lord on Mount Gerizim and killed our priests. Ever since, they have prevented us from rebuilding. Hiel had been to the mountain many times to attend festivals and to sacrifice. There, among the ruins, the Samaritans continued to worship in defiance of what the Judeans had done to them. "They tried to make it so that we couldn't worship," he muttered. "But we showed them. We worship among the ruins as a continual reminder to ourselves of their cruelty and impiety. We will not give them the satisfaction of stopping us from worshiping God." Hiel was so caught up in all of the reasons he had for hating Judeans that it took him a while to recognize what seemed like an odd pile of rags by the side of the road just ahead of him. Every step brought him closer, and the realization quickly began to dawn on him that this was not just garbage that someone had left. This was a person, or maybe it had recently been one. As he made out human features that were bruised and bloody, he began to understand what it was that had made the priest and the Levite so upset. Clearly, this man had been assaulted by one of the brigands that this road was famous for. They had beaten him, taken everything he had, and left him to die. As he saw this, he wondered why the others hadn't been willing to stop and help him. Weren't they all Judeans? They all worshipped in the same place, and, according to them, in the proper way. And yet, despite that, the priest and the Levite had seen no need to pause and help a fellow Judean. And sure, they might have given the excuse that if they did touch him and he died, which honestly he seemed close enough to be doing, it would have rendered them incapable of serving in the temple. No one who had come into contact with a dead body was allowed to serve without going through the purification rituals. But surely that was a silly excuse. The law was clear. The obligation to save someone's life mattered more than any concerns about purity. And anyways, neither of them had been traveling up to the temple, but rather away from it. So they did not have any temple duties to get back to. No, they had clearly shown in their actions that having things in common, even worshiping the same God in the same way, did not mean that they had to love one another. Perhaps seeing him had made them feel a bit uncomfortable, but they had felt no obligation to take care of him. But as Hiel stood there, looking down upon the bleeding Judean, he was left with one question. What about me? He had no doubt whatsoever that if their places were exchanged, if he were the one lying beaten by the side of the road instead, this man would not help him. He would only see a cursed Samaritan who didn't worship properly. The priest and the Levite would not give him a second thought either, unless that thought was that he deserved what had happened to him. If they had not helped their own countryman, they certainly would not help him. But did that let Hiel off the hook? Did he really want to become like them? No! The last thing he wanted was to be like a Judean. He did not want to become someone who judged and rejected someone else just because they were different or did things differently. And so, in that moment, Hiel decided to do the most un-Judean thing that he could think of. He opened his packs. He took out a bottle of the wine he was bringing back for trade and a jar of the oil. He took his second-best tunic and began to rip it into strips to make bandages. He took care of the wounded Judean by the side of the road, and then he put him on his donkey to take him someplace where he could recuperate. When Jesus was asked, "Who is my neighbor?" he answered with a story. And the story had a strange twist to it. He was speaking to fellow Judeans. You might expect him to tell them a story where a Judean performed an extraordinary act of love towards a hated Samaritan. But he didn't tell that story. He told the opposite. He told of a despised Samaritan who chose to love someone whom he had every reason to hate. It certainly made clear what the love of neighbor meant to Jesus. As far as he was concerned, you cannot limit love only to those most like you and closest to you. He told the story to illustrate that choosing to love those who are far away from us doesn't limit how much love you have. On the contrary, it only allows love to grow. For love is something that is limited only when we fail to share it. I also think that Jesus' story has many things to teach us about those that we are tempted to look down upon and despise. The Samaritans truly had never done anything to hurt the Judeans other than live their own lives and worship God in their own way. But the Judeans had attacked them, taken away their land, and destroyed their rituals and customs. I think that Jesus was saying something very powerful when he suggested that a Samaritan could choose to act in love towards a Judean. He was also challenging us to think critically about those whom we may have harmed. For, you see, when we have acted in hurtful ways towards others, it is always easier for us to think of them as somehow less than us. That was the ultimate source of the hatred of Judeans for Samaritans. They had attacked them, slaughtered them, and destroyed their temple. You don't think that they didn't feel a latent guilt about that? But so long as they didn't come face to face with the Samaritans' humanity, they didn't have to come to terms with what they, or their ancestors, had done to them. I wonder, does that teach us anything when we are tempted to look down upon or despise any group of people in our world? That is it for this episode of Retelling the Bible. Thanks for listening, and share the word. Tell others about this podcast. The theme music for the podcast is Ada by Kevin MacLeod, and the mood music for this episode was All the Lines by Sasha End. The music is licensed in the Creative Commons and can be found at incompetech.com and at Endy app, respectively. Contact me on Blue Sky at Retelling the Bible or on the Facebook page Retelling the Bible. Show notes for this episode have been posted at retellingthebible.wordpress.com. Thanks again to my Patreon supporters, and a special welcome to new supporter, Stéphane Palardi. Stéphane found this podcast through a couple of my favorites, Gil Kidron's podcast of Biblical Proportions and Gary Stevens' History in the Bible podcast. If you haven't, you should check them out too. Merci Stéphane pour ton soutien et encouragement. Go to patreon.com/retellingthebible to join the patrons in supporting this podcast. This is Retelling the Bible, and I have been your storyteller, W. Scott McCandless.